New Orleans is a city that's used to being awake. Even on an ordinary night, there's movement in the dark. A late streetcar, a back door closing, music drifting from a place that still has its lights on. But in 1918, and then again in 1919, the city's nights took on a different kind of vigilance. The kind where you listen not for jazz, but for a sound that doesn't belong. A scrape of wood, a careful knock, a hinge that should be still. The name we've inherited for that fear is simple: the Axeman of New Orleans. An unidentified attacker linked to a series of nighttime home invasions and assaults from May 1918 through October 1919. Never arrested, never confirmed, and still argued over in the details. And right away, the case asks you to hold two truths at once. The first is the one everyone remembers. The outline is chillingly consistent. Entry at night, sleeping victims, an axe often taken from the home, and a strange method of access that shows up again and again in the best-known cases. A panel in a back door chiseled out and left behind, as if the intruder wanted quiet more than speed. The second truth is harder. Once you start reading closely, the series doesn't stay neat. Some attacks match perfectly. Others feel adjacent. Some look like the same hand, while others look like a city folding every similar nightmare into one legend. It begins, in most accounts, on the night of May 23, 1918, with Joseph and Catherine Maggio attacked while sleeping in their apartment. What makes this first case so important isn't just that it's violent. It's that it sets the tone of the mystery. The intruder is inside long enough to do multiple things, and robbery doesn't explain it. The Maggios are attacked with a straight razor and an axe. And despite the chaos, the scene doesn't read like someone rummaging for valuables on the way out. Joseph is found alive but dies soon after. Catherine does not survive. A month later, in the early morning hours of June 27, 1918, the fear moves to a familiar kind of New Orleans setup. Living quarters attached to a business. Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe are attacked in the private rooms behind Bessemer's grocery, discovered the next morning by a delivery driver coming for a routine stop. The weapon detail is one of those pieces people cite because it feels like a signature. The hatchet, or axe involved, is described as belonging to the household, found on the property afterward. Both victims survive initially, but Lowe is left with serious, lasting injuries, and the case quickly turns into a noisy public mess. Arrests that don't stick, sensational headlines, accusations, and a record that becomes difficult to untangle cleanly, even in the moment. By August 5th, 1918, there's another attack that many writers treat as part of the same developing pattern. Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, assaulted in her apartment during the night and found later when her husband returns. What's notable here is how the case sits on the border between pattern and uncertainty. Doors and windows don't show obvious forced entry, and police lean toward the idea she's attacked with an object already inside the room. But investigators still speculate publicly about a connection to the earlier incidents. Again, there's no clean theft motive. Then, on August 10th, 1918, the case produces one of its clearest series moments. Joseph Romano, attacked in the room next to relatives, who hear the commotion and rush in as the assailant is fleeing. In this account, the witnesses get a quick impression. A heavyset man in dark clothing, and when police look around, they find the details that will keep showing up in Axeman retellings. A bloody axe on the property, the home disturbed, no property taken, and that unsettling carpentry again. A backdoor panel chiseled away. Romano dies a couple days later from his injuries. This is the moment where you can feel the case become the Axemen in the public imagination. Not because people suddenly have more certainty, they don't, but because the city now has a repeatable image. The quiet entry, the sleeping victims, the household axe, and the sense that the intruder is moving through New Orleans as if the back door is an invitation instead of a boundary. There's also a detail that shaped how the story was told from the beginning. Many early victims were Italian immigrants or Italian-American grocers, or connected to the grocery trade. Depending on who's telling the story, that becomes evidence of ethnic targeting, neighborhood opportunity, or a link to organized crime. But it's also a place where later retellings can get lazy, treating Italian grocer like shorthand for mafia, even when the evidence doesn't actually support that leap. A more grounded explanation is that these homes and stores often had predictable layouts and routines, and that predictability can matter as much as motive in a case like this. By the time New Orleans reached March of 1919, the pattern had started to feel familiar in the worst way. Nighttime, a quiet home, a back entrance that didn't look broken into so much as opened. A small panel worked loose, a latch reached. The house entered like it had been practiced. And then, in the dark, a sudden burst of violence that left survivors struggling to describe anything beyond a shape, a presence, and the feeling that the attacker had already slipped away. On the night of March 9th, 1919, the fear crosses the river to Gretna, just outside New Orleans. Charlie Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their little daughter Mary are attacked in their home. Neighbors hear the commotion. A nearby grocer, Orlando Giordano, rushes over. The scene is chaos, and the details that show up again and again in Axeman retellings show up here too. An entry point that suggests someone didn't want to make noise, and a sense that robbery still isn't the point. But what makes the Cortimiglia attack so important to the Axeman story isn't only what happened inside that house. It's what happens after. Because this is the moment where panic hardens into blame, and blame turns into something the city can punish. Gretna authorities focus on the Giordanos, who lived next door and had a business dispute with the Cortimiglias. According to Miriam C. Davis's account, officials pressured Rosie for an identification while she was still injured, then held her as a material witness, and only released her after she signed an affidavit implicating her neighbors. At trial, the case against Orlando and his teenage son Frank is thin. Rosie's identification is the centerpiece, even though her own doctor considered it unreliable. Still, both men are convicted. An elderly man sent to life in prison, a teenager sentenced to hang. And then, months later, Rosie recants. She says she didn't actually see her attackers, and that she's been pressured into naming the Giordanos. Eventually, the convictions unravel, and the Giordanos are freed, December 1920, according to Davis. So in the middle of an unsolved mystery, you get a very solved, very human outcome. The justice system finds a target it can reach, and the community's fears get an outlet until it can't hold up anymore. A week after the Gretna attack, the story takes a turn that makes it feel less like a case file and more like a piece of theater. On March 16th, 1919, the Times-Picayune publishes a letter from someone claiming to be the Axeman. It isn't vague and it isn't shy. It's written to the editor like a performance meant for an audience, opening with a grand address, "Esteemed mortal," as if the person behind it isn't just threatening a city, but starring in the threat. The writer insists they've never been seen and won't be caught, and they lean hard into the supernatural voice, not a man, but something invisible, something demonic, something that treats the police as a joke. They brag about choosing victims at will, talk about leaving almost nothing behind except a bloodied weapon, and warn the authorities not to rile them, the way someone talks when they want the other side to feel small. Then the letter narrows into a specific promise, delivered with eerie precision. The writer says that at exactly 12:15 a.m. on the next Tuesday night, they will pass over New Orleans, earthly time, they call it, and they offer what they frame as mercy, a proposition to the people. And that proposition is the reason the Axeman became permanently fused to the city's identity. The writer claims to be fond of jazz and says that anyone with a jazz band playing in full swing at that precise moment will be spared. If everyone plays jazz, they say, so much the better. But if any house is quiet, if anyone doesn't jazz it that night, the letter promises there may be consequences. Even if you've heard the story before, it's hard to miss what the letter is really doing. It isn't just threatening violence. It's trying to control a city's behavior, down to the minute, using fear as a kind of remote lever. And whether the writer was the real attacker or not, it worked, because New Orleans responded. Reports describe jazz parties springing up across town, cafes and bars filling, music coming from houses that had no business being awake after midnight. And afterwards, the paper noted that the Axeman didn't strike that night. But the letter also plants a second mystery inside the first. Was it authentic? Even reputable historical discussion raises the possibility that the voice of the letter, its educated, theatrical style, may not match what people assumed about the intruder, and that it could have been a hoax or publicity. Which leaves you with the strangest version of the question. If the most famous evidence in the case might not belong to the killer at all, then the city wasn't only being hunted, it was being watched, studied, and played. One of the strangest things about the Axeman legend is that the most famous artifact may not belong to the killer at all. Davis has argued that the letter reads more educated than you'd expect based on the way the attacker is typically described, and she points to the possibility of hoax or publicity stunt, especially given how quickly Axeman-themed music appears in the aftermath. The historic New Orleans collection highlights one of the key cultural echoes. Joseph John Davila, a local composer, writes and publishes The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa, explicitly inspired by the letter, and even uses a Times-Picayune character on the cover. And the pushback isn't only modern. As reported in Country Roads magazine, an Algiers paper at the time criticized the letter as likely a joke and accused the newspaper of spreading fear rather than helping catch whoever was actually doing the attacks. So you end up with a mystery inside a mystery. If the letter was the killer, then the Axeman wasn't only violent, he was theatrical, organized, and very aware of how a city panics. If the letter was a hoax, then the jazz night is still real, but it's a city reacting to a performance, not a confession. Either way, the result is the same. The Axeman becomes immortal. If you tell the Axeman's story as a tight arc, you can frame it like this. Early attacks in 1918, a horrifying crescendo into March 1919, the jazz letter, and then silence. But the record doesn't stay silent. Later in 1919, more attacks are often linked to the Axeman name. A grocer named Steve Boca is attacked in August, and the familiar details appear again in retellings. Nighttime, a sudden assault, and entry connected to the back of the house. In September, Sarah Lawman is attacked in her apartment and survives. And in late October, Mike Pepitone is killed, often treated as the final Axeman attack. But here's the problem. When you stack these incidents together, the Axeman stops looking like a single clean spree and starts looking like a category the city created. Axe attacks that feel similar, whether or not they truly belong to one person. Even Davis, who absolutely treats the Axeman as a real serial offender in the core period, argues that some attacks later attributed to the Axeman may not have been part of the same pattern, and suggests that at least some of the violence around Italian grocers could have overlapped with vendettas and old disputes that were already present in the community. That's why the numbers never stabilize. Depending on which incidents a source includes, the victim count swings wildly, and the timeline expands or contracts. You can tell the story with 6 dead, or you can tell it with a much wider ring of injuries and questionable links. And then there's a suspect thread that keeps reappearing at the edge of the case, like a shadow you notice in your peripheral vision and then lose the moment you turn toward it. The Historic New Orleans collection notes that a suspect emerged later, a man in Los Angeles who was killed by the widow of the last New Orleans victim. And the reason people hold on to that detail is obvious. It feels like the story is trying, finally, to close its own loop. But even that moment doesn't settle the case. No one was arrested for the New Orleans attacks, and whatever happened later in Los Angeles doesn't arrive with the kind of proof that turns legend into resolution. And then there's a suspect thread that keeps reappearing at the edge of the Axeman story, partly because it's one of the only places where the case seems to almost hand you a name. The thread begins with Mike Pepitone, the grocer whose death on October of 1919 is often treated as the last major Axeman killing in New Orleans. Pepitone's widow is usually named Esther, and she's the reason this story survives at all. Because a year or two later, the Axeman legend follows her across the country. In the version of events repeated in later summaries, Esther remarried and moved to Los Angeles. Then something unsettling happens again. Her second husband disappeared under strange circumstances, and not long after that, a man came to her house demanding money. In some retellings, the demand was $500. When she didn't immediately comply, the man threatened her, telling her that he would kill her the way he killed her first husband. And, as the story is told, he reached as if for a weapon. Esther fired. The man died. That man is the figure who becomes the suspect. Depending on the source, his name appears in different spellings. Joseph Manfrey, Mumfrey, or Monfrey. And that spelling drift is part of what makes this thread hard to pin down with complete confidence. But the basic shape of the claim is consistent. Esther said the man she shot had confessed, and that he was responsible for Pepitone's murder, sometimes expanded into the claim that he was the Axeman. There are a few reasons this story gained traction beyond the drama of the moment. One is that it offers what the original case never did, a name you can point to. Another is that, in some accounts, This man had a criminal background, and writers sometimes connect him to earlier suspicion involving threats or violence around Italian grocers. Details that feel like they fit the pattern people already associate with Axeman years. But even with all that, the suspect thread remains exactly that, a thread. It isn't an arrest. It isn't a solved case file. It's a story that depends heavily on one person's account, told after the fact, far from New Orleans, in circumstances that were frightening and complicated in their own right. And once a story like that enters the Axeman orbit, it tends to get repeated in a way that makes it sound more solid with each retelling, even when the documentation underneath it stays thin. So the Manfrey name ends up behaving like so much of the Axeman case. It's partly anchored, because the Los Angeles incident was real, and newspapers did report on a widow who said the man she shot had threatened her and claimed responsibility. But it's also partly adrift, because the leap from that moment to a definitive identity for the New Orleans attacks is something the evidence can't fully lock into place. And that's why the suspect story never lands with the clear certainty people want. It offers a shape that feels like an ending, but it doesn't arrive at one. When people come back to the Axeman story, it's usually because of how quickly it turned from ordinary life into something surreal. There are only a few key images, but they're powerful. A quiet back door, a small panel worked loose, footsteps where there shouldn't be any. And then, in the middle of real violence and real fear, a letter arrives that reads like theater, and a whole city answers it with music. What makes the case so unsettling is the uncertainty doesn't stay in one place. It doesn't live only in the missing identity. It spreads into the shape of the series itself. Which incidents truly belong? Which ones are adjacent? Which ones might be copycats? Which ones became connected because everyone needed them to become connected? Even the jazz letter, the most famous artifact in the whole story, comes with its own quiet doubt. The possibility that it wasn't written by the attacker at all, that it may have been a hoax, a performance the newspapers helped amplify. If that's true, it doesn't make the fear less real. It just means the fear had two sources: the violence itself and the story built around it. And the saddest part is what happens when a community can't live with uncertainty. The Gretna case becomes a reminder of that. How quickly people can accept an answer that doesn't hold, and how long it can take to undo it once it hardens into something official. So if you're listening to this the way people listen at night, letting the details come and go, the Axeman isn't only a mystery about an unknown intruder. It's also a story about a city trying to protect itself with pattern and ritual, trying to believe that if you understand the rules, you can keep danger on the other side of the door. The music eventually faded. The headlines moved on. And whoever the Axeman was, one person, more than one, or a name that became a container for several different nights, he slipped out of history without giving New Orleans the one thing it wanted most: an ending.